All right, and welcome back to our next module in the Power BI Custom Visuals course. In this module, we're going to be looking at the Force-Directed Graph. Now, the Force-Directed Graph is developed by Microsoft, and this is a really interesting one that allows you to look at relationships between different entities that you have. So say, for example, you wanted to analyze how many emails that you have between coworkers. If you could get that email data in, which you do have the ability to do with Power BI, you could then see what kind of relationships you have between each of your coworkers and your emails. So the thicker the line that you have would indicate the more or the stronger the relationship that you have between the two entities. So maybe you email between yourself and one of your coworkers, Jim, most often. And then maybe for me, I do a lot of strange things. Like I email myself a lot. Mainly when I think of interesting things that I want to know or remember at work, I email myself and I might see a strong relationship between myself. And so you can take that kind of data and use it inside the force-directed graph to be able to see what kind of relationships that you have. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at how you can use the force-directed graph and where to go download it and how to get started with it. All right, so your first step, as always, is to go to the Power BI Custom Visuals gallery, which you can find by going to visuals.powerbi.com. And as you scroll down in the gallery, you'll find the force-directed graph right here. And you're going to go ahead and select the force-directed graph and download the visual. Now, I've already downloaded it, so I'm not going to bother doing it again, but this is where you can go find it. Now, just to point out here, we have looked at a ton of these other visuals now at this point. This one, if you want to compare it to one of the other ones, is kind of, but not completely, similar to the chord graph that we saw before, the chord chart. And the way that it's similar is that it shows relationships between two entities. That's the main way that it's similar to the chord. All right, let's go ahead and now take a look at now that we've got the visual downloaded, let's go over to the Power BI desktop and show how to use it. All right, so the first thing I want to do with you is to go ahead and get the data that we're going to be using for this example. Now, to set the stage for this one, the data that we're going to be using is my blog data, at least pretend blog data. And we're going to be looking at where people started on my blog and what did they click to next, meaning which are the blog posts that are most interesting for folks and where did they start at before they actually clicked on anything. So let's go ahead and go up to the Get Data section here in the Power BI desktop. And we're going to select Excel as a source just to make this simple for us. And you're going to find this is available where you can click below to download the data source, but the one that we're going to be using today is going to be called Blog Visits. So I'll select Blog Visits here and click Open. Now, once the Navigator pane opens up, you should see the spreadsheet that we're going to be using called Page Visits, and we'll see each of the locations. So this is the source location where the user started, which is either on my home page or the archive section, or they might have also started on the About Me page, and then we have which blog they went to from there. I also have the number of views, so how many times they viewed a particular blog, and which are my most popular blogs. So it's like my Hyper-V blog is most popular. All right, so I'll go ahead now and hit load. I don't need to make any changes to the data, so I'll hit load to take this and add it to my data model. And we should see once that's done loading that it shows up in the field list on the right-hand side. All right, so my next step then is to go ahead and import the visual that we want to use for this example, which is the force-directed graph. To import that visual, you'll go to the visualization section here and select Import from File and import a custom visual. Go ahead and hit Import past the little warning sign here. And we're going to select the custom visual here that we downloaded just a moment ago called the force graph. So I'll select the force graph and hit Open. All right, so it's successfully imported that. Once I hit OK, you'll see it now show up in my visualizations list. And before we use that, though, I want to show you a little bit of the data just by bringing it into a table. So I'll select a table here first. And from there, we'll go ahead and bring in our source, our target, and our number of views into the report. And we can easily increase the text size on that table just by going over to the Format section here and bumping up the text size a little bit so you can read the data a little bit better. There we go. All right, so you can see what kind of data we're looking at. This has the source that we started at, which could either be my home page or my About Me page, and then where did people go after the fact. And then the number of views that they had for each. Now, what I'd like to do is take this data, now that you've seen what it looks like a little bit, and go ahead and put it into the force-directed graph, which we just imported a moment ago right here. So I'll select the force-directed graph, and you can see that it does indeed change my table into a force-directed graph here. Now we're going to add and change a lot of things with this, but just to point out to you how this thing works, as you grab things, you can move them around if you wanted to. You can kind of play around with the placement of these items. I can move them around, shift them around if I'd like. You can also hover above any one of these to get a tooltip that pops up and tells you what the source and what the target was and what the total number of views are. So it's nice that you can see the relationships. Again, the thicker the line is, the stronger the relationship between the two is. That's the number of views is represented by that. But there's a lot of other things that we can do in here as well. Let's show you a few of the things that you can do and modify. If I want to modify this visual a little bit more, you can select the chart or the graph here and go to the paintbrush or the format item here. And we're going to kind of work our way from the top down, going through and showing you the different types of ways you can customize the force-directed graph. Let's start by looking at the data label section here for a moment. So I'm going to expand data labels. And inside the data label section here, you can see that you can indeed increase the text size of the data labels. That's the text. You can see it increasing as I make the adjustment here in the format section. You can also change the color of the labels if you wanted to. Rather than being that gray color, you can make it a more clear black if you wanted to. And that's looking kind of funky there because the movement. I'll flip it back over to the gray. All right, so you can play around with those things a little bit. That's what's underneath the data label section. You can also, if you go down to the links section, this is where you're allowed to actually modify how the visual looks from the arrows or the links between each of the entities that we have here. So for example, if you wanted to, you can turn on this arrow capability, which shows you all of these are kind of outgoing values, meaning I don't have anybody going from a blog to the home page. Everyone's going from the home page out to a blog, and that's what the arrows are representing there. You can also turn on the labels. So if you flip on labels here, what that'll do is actually show you the values on top of each of those arrows or each of those entity relationships, and it'll show you how many views that we've had for each. So you can see indeed here there's 592 showing for this one here. If you hover above it, you'll get a tooltip that shows that same number. All right, next you can also do a few things here with the links. So again, the links are the lines between the two indicators. I'm going to turn off the arrow for a moment. We don't need that. But what I will show you here is how you can change the color. So you'll notice here that right now it's set to interactive. Interactive means that it's based off of the data elements that you have. So if I go back over to the field well here, if I change the link type, if I have another field in here that differentiates the different relationships I have, and I add it to the link type, that would actually change the color of the lines between them. Now, if you don't have any field to put in the link type, like me in this case, I don't, I can actually manually change the color here by going underneath this color property here, underneath links, and I can change it to by weight, for example, and I can adjust it so that I can see that the ones that have the this color here is actually going to have a different color, that basically the ones that are closer to that color have the most values associated with them. There's a few other things here. You can also change the formatting or the display of those numbers. And again, we have those numbers that are showing right now because we turned on the labels. You could change those values. So if you wanted to see it in millions, for example, that's kind of a bad choice here because now it's showing all of them as 0 million. Really, auto is the best choice there if you have the data labels on. You can also turn off the thickness. So if you don't want to see the thickness adjusted at all based on something, you can turn off the thickness, and it's just plain lines here, basically. So you have some ability to modify that there as well. I'm going to turn the thickness back on. I think that would make sense. All right, the next thing that we're going to look at then is we'll go and work our way a little bit farther down. You'll see underneath the node section here that you can actually turn on an image for each node. So right now, the node is kind of the endpoint that we have at each of the different categories that we have. And if we wanted to, we can turn on an actual image to appear there. And by default, it kind of shows this little home image, but you have the ability to actually change it from that home image to an image of your choosing. And I happen to have an image here for us to use, and I'll expand this to you so you can see it. This will also be in our follow-up blog, but here is the, you can, of course, pause the video if you'd like to see this and type it out, but we'll have this available for you to find somewhere else. But you can get that URL and plug that in, and notice what happened when I use that URL instead is now I can see the image that's being based off of, often each node is based off of that URL and not just the little indicator that is there by default. You can also change a few other things here if you want to adjust the length of the name that's used for each node, so the labels on each node. Right now it's set to 10 character links, but you can adjust that and say, well, really, I want to see 20 character links, and then it gives you a little better idea of what each of those blogs are. Now, you want to be careful with that, of course. If you go too long, like say 200, then it gets really messy to read here. It's kind of difficult to understand what's going on. So I'll leave it at something like 20. All right, then the next section here that you have is the size section. Underneath the size section, this is where you're able to adjust how much of the size or how much of the canvas it's actually taking up. So you can see here the outline that we have is the graph should be taking up this entire section here, but it's not, and that's because of the size property. The size property has a setting in here called charge, and based on what you set in the charge section, it'll take up more or less of the space on the chart area or the graph area. And so what I might want to do is adjust this to something like -40, and you'll see it takes up much more space in the design surface, and it's actually using more of the space that we have available to it. Now, when you do this, you might also want to change things like the data label size or the node label size. You can adjust some of those things based on how much space you're giving it inside the graph area. Okay? So kind of a nice thing to do here. It gives you some neat capabilities. Now, one of the things that's really common to do with the force graph is to bring in some other form of a filter to be able to work on. And by the way, before we do this, I should mention there are all of the typical types of formatting that you can do on here. If you wanted to turn on a title, you of course can do that, but I'd have to give it some kind of name here. I can call this my force graph example. And so that's going to add a label up here in the top, and then you can center that and increase the text size. So you have the ability to do things like that, just like you can do in any other chart that we've looked at. You can add a border around this if you'd wanted to. That's fine. All that same things, these last 5 properties here exist in just about every one of the visuals that you'll use. But the last thing I want to show you that's very common to do with the force graph is to bring in some form of a filter to use with it. So for example, let's say we want to bring in a slicer. I'll select a slicer here, and I'll tell it that I want to do a slicer based on the source, so where the user came from. And I'll increase the size of this so we can read it a little bit better. Let's go underneath the item section here and bump up the text size a little bit so we can actually read that. And then what's nice about this is now it allows you to actually filter down the force graph and use it a little bit more cleanly. So for example, if I wanted to see just everything that came from the home page, I can select the home page option here, and you'll see now it's focused me in on just that area. Or if you wanted to see everyone that came from the About Me page, I can select just About Me, and now we're seeing just the About Me page. You could, of course, multi-select those, and you see both of them again, so both of them appear there. But using some form of a filter really makes it easier to be able to clearly view this data, and it makes a very interesting way of viewing the chart. So I recommend whenever you use the force graph, to also have some form of a filter to really filter down the data, especially when you have many different nodes that you're working with here. All right, so that is it for the force graph. I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and we look forward to showing you our next custom visual.